Klong Prem's notorious reputation. Klong Prem Central Prison, often referred to as the Bangkok Hilton, carries a reputation that is anything but luxurious. For decades, it has been known as one of the toughest and most unforgiving prisons in Thailand. Originally built to house a limited number of inmates, it has become a place of extreme overcrowding, suffering, and despair. The prison complex consists of several sections, including a high-security unit for serious offenders and the infamous Bombat, or remand prison, where prisoners awaiting trial are held. Unlike many modern correctional facilities that focus on rehabilitation, Klong Prem operates under a rigid and punitive system. It is a place where inmates are stripped of their dignity and forced to endure harsh conditions that break the spirit long before a sentence is served. The prison is notorious for housing both Thai and foreign inmates, many of whom have been caught in Thailand's strict and unforgiving legal system. Foreign prisoners, in particular, often find themselves lost in a bureaucratic nightmare, facing language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and a legal process that offers little mercy. One of the most alarming aspects of Klong Prem's reputation is its history of brutality and corruption. Reports from former inmates describe extreme violence within the prison walls, not just among prisoners, but sometimes at the hands of the guards themselves. Beatings, forced labor, and other forms of punishment are common, reinforcing the belief that once someone enters Klong Prem, they may never truly escape, even if they are eventually released. The prison has also been linked to numerous human rights concerns. International organizations and former prisoners have spoken out about the lack of medical care, malnutrition, and the psychological trauma inflicted upon those who serve time there. Many inmates suffer from untreated illnesses, and in some cases, prisoners have died due to medical neglect. The conditions are so dire that many have described the experience as worse than the crime they committed, raising ethical questions about the purpose of imprisonment in such a place. Despite its grim reputation, Klong Prem continues to operate with little oversight or reform. While prison authorities claim to be taking steps to improve conditions, first-hand accounts suggest that little has changed. For those who enter, Klong Prem is not just a prison. It is a place of no return, where hope fades and survival becomes the only goal. Severe overcrowding. One of the most harrowing aspects of life in Klong Prem Central Prison is the extreme overcrowding that plagues its cells. Originally built to house a fraction of its current population, the prison now holds thousands more inmates than it was ever designed for. This has led to conditions that are not just uncomfortable, but inhumane, turning what is meant to be a correctional facility into a place of suffering and survival. Prisoners are crammed into small, poorly ventilated cells, with dozens of men forced to share a space meant for only a handful. Inmates must sleep on the hard floor, often pressed up against one another, with barely enough room to stretch their legs. Some prisoners are forced to sleep in shifts, one group lying down while the other sits or stands, because there is simply not enough space for everyone to rest at the same time. The unbearable heat, combined with the lack of fresh air, creates an oppressive and suffocating atmosphere that can break even the strongest individuals. The lack of space also leads to serious hygiene and sanitation issues. With only a few toilets available for hundreds of inmates, proper sanitation is nearly impossible to maintain. The stench of unwashed bodies, human waste, and rotting food fills the air, making each day a test of endurance. In such conditions, diseases spread rapidly, with skin infections, respiratory illnesses, and gastrointestinal diseases becoming common among inmates. Medical care is limited, and prisoners suffering from illness are often left untreated, forced to endure their pain without any relief. Overcrowding also increases tensions among inmates, leading to frequent fights and violence. When people are forced into such close quarters with no personal space or sense of privacy, tempers flare, and even the smallest disputes can escalate into brutal confrontations. Gangs and power structures form within the prison, with stronger inmates often preying on the weak. Those who lack money, connections, or physical strength are the most vulnerable, facing constant threats of assault, extortion, and even sexual violence. The psychological impact of overcrowding is just as severe as the physical toll. Prisoners lose their sense of identity and humanity as they become just another number in a sea of suffering. The lack of personal space, the inability to escape the noise and chaos, and the constant threat of violence create an environment of extreme stress and anxiety. Many inmates develop severe depression, and some even resort to self-harm or suicide as a means of escape. Despite these inhumane conditions, little is done to address the issue. The prison system remains overwhelmed, with more inmates entering than leaving. Thailand's strict drug laws and harsh sentencing policies contribute to the growing prison population, making overcrowding an issue that only continues to worsen. Attempts to introduce reforms have been slow, and in the meantime, thousands of prisoners remain trapped in a space that barely allows them to breathe, let alone live with dignity. Lack of basic human rights. Inside Klong Prem Central Prison, basic human rights are a luxury that many inmates can only dream of. The prison system, designed more for punishment than rehabilitation, fails to meet even the most fundamental standards of humane treatment. Prisoners are subjected to inhumane living conditions, deprived of basic necessities like clean water, adequate food, medical care, and proper sanitation. For many, survival becomes a daily struggle, as they navigate a system that seems to view them as less than human. One of the most severe issues is the lack of access to clean water. Prisoners are often forced to rely on dirty, contaminated water for drinking, bathing, and even cooking. The prison's water supply is not always consistent, and when it does come, it is often discolored and foul-smelling. Inmates sometimes have to purchase bottled water, but this is only an option for those with financial means. The rest must make do with what is available, leading to dehydration, kidney problems, and frequent bouts of illness caused by bacterial infections. Food is another major concern. The meals provided to prisoners are often of extremely poor quality, consisting of little more than rice, watery soup, and scraps of meat or vegetables. The portions are small, leaving many inmates hungry and malnourished. Those who have money can purchase additional food from the prison canteen, but for those without financial resources, hunger becomes a constant companion. The lack of proper nutrition weakens the body, making prisoners more susceptible to illness and disease. Medical care is almost non-existent in Klong Prem. There is a small infirmary, but it is severely understaffed and lacks essential medicines and medical supplies. Many inmates suffer from chronic illnesses that go untreated, while others succumb to easily preventable diseases due to the lack of proper health care. Prisoners who fall seriously ill must wait for days or even weeks before they receive medical attention, and in some cases, their conditions worsen to the point of becoming life-threatening. Infectious diseases such as tuberculosis, hepatitis, and skin infections spread rapidly due to the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. Yet little is done to contain outbreaks or provide adequate treatment. Sanitation is another area where the prison fails to meet even the most basic standards. With limited access to soap, toilet paper, and clean clothes, maintaining personal hygiene is almost impossible. Prisoners are often forced to wear the same filthy clothes for weeks, and access to showers is restricted. The prison's toilets are few and far between, often overflowing and reeking of human waste. Inmates must endure the stench and filth on a daily basis, further degrading their dignity and well-being. Beyond the physical suffering, prisoners in Klong Prem are also denied basic human rights in terms of their treatment by the prison authorities. Beatings and other forms of physical punishment are common, with guards using extreme force to maintain order. Complaints of abuse are rarely taken seriously, and prisoners who speak out often face retaliation. There is little to no access to legal support, making it difficult for inmates to appeal their sentences or fight against mistreatment. Many prisoners are forgotten by the outside world, with no communication with their families or legal representatives. In essence, the conditions inside Klong Prem strip prisoners of their humanity. They are treated as if they're no longer people, but mere bodies taking up space. The lack of basic human rights is not just a failure of the prison system. It is a violation of fundamental human dignity. Corruption inside the prison. Corruption is deeply embedded in the daily operations of Klong Prem Central Prison, affecting every aspect of prison life. From a moment an inmate enters, they quickly learn that survival often depends not just on strength or resilience, but on money and connections. The prison operates under an unspoken rule. Those who can afford to pay bribes will receive better treatment, while those who have nothing are left to suffer under the worst conditions. At the heart of this corruption are the prison guards, many of whom are underpaid and overworked. With low salaries and difficult working conditions, some guards turn to bribery as a way to supplement their income. They often demand money from prisoners in exchange for basic necessities such as better food, access to a clean cell, or even medical care. Those who refuse or cannot afford to pay are left to endure the prison's harshest conditions without any relief. One of the most common forms of corruption in Klong Prem is the sale of privileges. Inmates who have money, either from personal wealth or from financial support outside the prison, can pay to receive special treatment. This may include access to private cells, extra food rations, better sleeping arrangements, or even mobile phones, which are technically forbidden but widely available to those who can afford them. Some wealthier prisoners are even able to pay for protection from violent gangs or aggressive guards, ensuring their safety in an otherwise dangerous environment. Drugs are another major aspect of corruption within Klong Prem. Despite strict drug laws in Thailand, illegal substances are widely available inside the prison, often smuggled in by corrupt officials who profit from the trade. Prisoners with enough money can purchase drugs, while those without are sometimes forced into the trade as a means of survival. The presence of drugs leads to further violence and instability within the prison, as rival gangs compete for control over the illicit market. Many prisoners who were arrested for drug-related offenses outside find themselves trapped in the same cycle of addiction and crime even within the prison walls. Corruption also extends to medical care. While healthcare in Klong Prem is already limited, it becomes almost non-existent for those who cannot afford to pay for treatment. Prisoners who are sick or injured must often bribe guards or medical staff just to receive basic care. Those who lack money are left to suffer, even in cases where their conditions are life-threatening. In some instances, inmates have reportedly died because they were unable to pay for medical attention that could have saved them. Legal proceedings and sentence reductions are also influenced by corruption. While Thailand's legal system does allow for sentence reductions based on good behavior, in many cases, these reductions are granted based on financial transactions rather than merit. Wealthy prisoners can pay bribes to secure early release, while poor inmates are forced to serve their full sentences regardless of their conduct. Some prisoners have even been falsely accused of breaking prison rules simply because they could not afford to pay off corrupt officials, leading to extended sentences or harsher punishments. The corruption in Klong Prem creates a system where justice is not based on fairness or rehabilitation, but on wealth and power. Those who have money can manipulate the system to their advantage, while those who are poor are left to suffer in the worst possible conditions. This not only undermines the purpose of incarceration, but also perpetuates a cycle of inequality and abuse that extends far beyond the prison walls. Harsh punishments. Life inside Klong Prem Central Prison is ruled by an unforgiving system where strict regulations dictate every aspect of an inmate's existence. Any deviation from the rules, no matter how minor, can result in severe punishment. The prison operates under a rigid hierarchy where power is concentrated in the hands of the guards, and inmates have little to no rights. Punishments are often excessive, designed to instill fear and maintain absolute control over the prison population. One of the most common forms of punishment is physical violence. Guards have been known to beat prisoners with batons, kick them, or subject them to other forms of brutality for infractions as small as speaking out of turn or failing to line up quickly enough. Inmates who resist orders or show any signs of defiance are often targeted for particularly harsh treatment, with some being dragged to isolated areas where they are beaten away from the view of others. This physical abuse serves not only as a means of discipline, but also as a warning to the rest of the inmates. Any disobedience will be met with force. Another cruel punishment is the use of shackles. Some prisoners, especially those deemed as troublemakers, are forced to wear heavy iron shackles around their ankles for weeks or even months at a time. These chains make even basic movement difficult and painful, turning simple tasks like walking or sleeping into agonizing experiences. The shackles are often rusted and poorly maintained, causing painful sores and infections on the prisoner's legs. Despite the suffering they cause, inmates are given no medical attention for their injuries, and many are left with permanent scars. Solitary confinement is another dreaded punishment within Klong Prem. Prisoners who are caught violating rules may be thrown into small, dark, and filthy isolation cells for days or even weeks. These cells have little to no ventilation, and prisoners are often forced to sit in complete darkness, deprived of human contact. Food and water are given in minimal amounts, and many prisoners emerge from solitary confinement severely weakened, both physically and mentally. The psychological effects of isolation can be devastating, with many inmates experiencing hallucinations, extreme anxiety, and depression. Humiliation is also a common method of punishment. Guards sometimes force prisoners to strip naked and perform degrading acts in front of others as a form of humiliation. Public beatings are also common, with inmates being forced to watch as their fellow prisoners are physically punished, reinforcing a climate of fear and submission. These humiliating punishments break down the prisoner's sense of self-worth, making them feel powerless and completely under the control of the prison authorities. In addition to physical punishments, the prison also enforces psychological torture. Prisoners are made to endure extreme stress through sleep deprivation, forced labor, and unpredictable rule changes designed to keep them in a constant state of anxiety. Some inmates are woken up in the middle of the night for arbitrary inspections, while others are forced to perform exhausting physical exercises as a form of collective punishment. The lack of consistency in rule enforcement means that prisoners never know when they might be punished, leaving them in a state of perpetual fear. Beyond the immediate suffering these punishments cause, they also contribute to long-term psychological trauma. Many inmates leave Klong Prem with severe mental health issues, struggling to reintegrate into society after enduring years of abuse. The brutal disciplinary system does not rehabilitate prisoners, but instead hardens them, making it more difficult for them to escape the cycle of crime and incarceration. Drug trade and violence. Inside Klong Prem Central Prison, the presence of drugs and the violence associated with them create a dangerous and chaotic environment where survival is often determined by one's ability to navigate a world ruled by gangs, corrupt guards, and an underground economy. Despite Thailand's harsh anti-drug laws, illegal substances such as methamphetamine, commonly known as YBA, heroin, and marijuana are widely available within the prison. The drug trade flourishes behind bars, fueling a cycle of addiction, debt, and brutality that makes life even more unbearable for those trapped inside. The drug trade inside Klong Prem is controlled by powerful prison gangs, who operate under the watchful but complicit eyes of corrupt officials. These gangs smuggle in drugs through a variety of methods, hidden inside food deliveries, bribe guards, or even through visiting relatives who are forced or paid to act as couriers. Once inside, the drugs are distributed among prisoners, either for personal use or for resale to other inmates. Some prisoners who are incarcerated for minor drug offenses find themselves drawn into deeper criminal activity while inside, as they are pressured or forced to work for the gangs just to survive. For many inmates, drugs provide a temporary escape from the harsh reality of prison life. The unbearable conditions, overcrowding, violence, malnutrition, and lack of medical care drive many to seek relief through substance abuse. However, addiction only worsens their suffering, as prisoners who become dependent on drugs often fall into debt with the very gangs that supplied them. These debts can quickly spiral out of control, leading to brutal consequences. Prisoners who fail to pay back what they owe may be subjected to severe beatings, forced into dangerous tasks for the gang, or even killed as an example to others. Violence is an everyday reality in Klong Prem, and much of it is directly linked to the drug trade. Rival gangs frequently clash over control of smuggling routes and sales operations, leading to bloody confrontations within the prison walls. Stabbings, beatings, and even murders occur with alarming regularity, yet prison authorities often turn a blind eye, either out of fear or because they are financially benefiting from the drug trade themselves. Guards who do intervene may do so selectively, taking sides in gang disputes in exchange for bribes. The general population of inmates is often caught in the crossfire of these violent conflicts. Fights can erupt over the smallest of disagreements, and prisoners who are not affiliated with any gang must tread carefully to avoid becoming unintended victims. In some cases, newly arrived prisoners are forced to choose a side, as refusing to align with a gang can make them targets for extortion and abuse. Those who resist gang recruitment may be beaten into submission or have their limited belongings stolen. Weapons are another significant issue, contributing to the violence in Klong Prem. Despite strict security measures, knives, razor blades, and makeshift weapons are common within the prison. Inmates craft weapons from everyday objects, sharpening toothbrushes into stabbing tools or using metal scraps to create deadly blades. These weapons are often used in violent encounters, making even minor disputes potentially fatal. Prisoners live in a constant state of fear, knowing that a simple misunderstanding or being in the wrong place at the wrong time could cost them their lives. Sexual violence is also a dark reality within the prison, often tied to the power struggles created by the drug trade. Vulnerable prisoners, especially younger or weaker individuals, are sometimes exploited or trafficked by gangs in exchange for drugs or as a form of punishment. Reports from former inmates suggest that authorities do little to protect those who fall victim to these crimes, as corruption and fear keep many guards from intervening. For those who wish to stay out of trouble, avoiding drugs and violence is nearly impossible. Inmates who refuse to participate in the drug trade or gang activity often face intimidation, extortion, or forced labor. Some prisoners pay protection money to powerful inmates or guards in hopes of staying safe, but this is not a guarantee. Others resort to self-isolation, withdrawing from social interaction to minimize their exposure to danger. But in a prison as overcrowded as Klong Prem, there is nowhere to truly hide. Ultimately, the rampant drug trade and the violence that comes with it turn Klong Prem into an even more brutal and lawless place. Instead of being a facility focused on rehabilitation, it becomes a breeding ground for deeper criminal involvement, where many leave prison even more damaged and dangerous than when they arrived. Mental and physical health deterioration. Life inside Klong Prem Central Prison takes an unbearable toll on both the mind and body. The harsh conditions, overcrowding, violence, malnutrition, and lack of medical care create an environment where inmates slowly deteriorate, both physically and mentally. For many prisoners, survival becomes a daily struggle as their bodies weaken from disease and poor nutrition, while their minds collapse under the weight of stress, fear, and hopelessness. Physically, prisoners suffer from a range of illnesses caused by the deplorable living conditions. Malnutrition is one of the most common problems, as the food provided in the prison is inadequate both in quantity and quality. Meals usually consist of small portions of rice, watery soup, and scraps of protein, often prepared under unsanitary conditions. The lack of essential nutrients leads to rapid weight loss, muscle weakness, and weakened immune systems, making inmates vulnerable to infections and disease. Those who can afford it may buy extra food from the prison canteen, but for the majority who have no financial support from the outside, hunger is a constant companion. Diseases spread quickly within Klong Prem due to overcrowding, poor hygiene, and inadequate health care. Skin infections, tuberculosis, and respiratory illnesses are rampant, with little to no medical treatment available. The lack of clean water and proper sanitation makes prisoners susceptible to gastrointestinal diseases, chronic diarrhea, and severe dehydration. The prison's medical facilities are severely underfunded, with a small, understaffed infirmary that lacks even basic medicines. Many prisoners who fall seriously ill are simply left to suffer in their overcrowded cells, without treatment or pain relief. In some cases, inmates have died from conditions that could have been easily treated if proper health care were available. Beyond physical suffering, the mental health toll of life in Klong Prem is devastating. The extreme stress of prison life, combined with the uncertainty of long sentences and brutal punishments, leads many inmates to develop severe psychological conditions. Anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, are common, with many prisoners experiencing frequent panic attacks and overwhelming feelings of despair. The constant fear of violence, coupled with the inhumane treatment by guards and fellow inmates, creates an environment of relentless psychological torture. Solitary confinement, used as a punishment for disobedience, further damages inmates' mental well-being. Prisoners locked in tiny, windowless cells for days or even weeks at a time often emerge in a fragile psychological state. The lack of human contact, the darkness, and the extreme isolation break down the mind, causing hallucinations, paranoia, and, in some cases, complete mental breakdowns. Many prisoners in solitary confinement engage in self-harm, scratching their skin raw, banging their heads against the walls, or even attempting suicide as a desperate escape from the torment. Sleep deprivation is another serious issue that contributes to the mental and physical breakdown of inmates. Due to overcrowding, prisoners are often forced to sleep in shifts, with some lying down while others remain standing or sitting, waiting for their turn to rest. The lack of space, combined with the noise of hundreds of men packed together in a single cell, makes proper rest nearly impossible. Chronic exhaustion weakens the body and further deteriorates mental health, making prisoners more vulnerable to disease, aggression, and suicidal thoughts. For those who have already struggled with mental health issues before entering Klong Prem, the prison's conditions only accelerate their decline. There is no psychological counseling, no rehabilitation programs, and no support for inmates suffering from mental illness. Instead, they are often ignored, mocked, or, in extreme cases, physically abused by guards who see mental instability as a sign of weakness or disobedience. Some inmates develop symptoms of psychosis, experiencing hallucinations and paranoia, yet they receive no medical treatment or psychiatric care. Suicide is tragically common in Klong Prem. Faced with unending suffering, some inmates see death as their only escape. Prisoners have been found hanging from cell bars, overdosing on smuggled drugs, or inflicting fatal wounds upon themselves. Others, though not actively seeking to end their lives, become so weak and ill that they simply give up, refusing to eat or move, waiting for death to take them. The prison administration rarely intervenes to prevent suicides, treating these deaths as routine occurrences rather than preventable tragedies. For those who do survive their time in Klong Prem, the damage is often irreversible. Many leave the prison with chronic physical ailments, permanently weakened by years of malnutrition and untreated disease. Mentally, they struggle to reintegrate into society, haunted by the trauma of what they endured. Some former inmates develop severe PTSD, unable to sleep without nightmares of their time in prison. Others become numb and emotionally detached, unable to connect with loved ones or function in a normal environment. Rather than serving as a correctional facility focused on rehabilitation, Klong Prem acts as a place where bodies and minds are systematically broken. Instead of preparing inmates to reintegrate into society, it leaves them physically debilitated and psychologically shattered, ensuring that even after release, they are never truly free. Overcrowding and unbearable living conditions. Klong Prem Central Prison is a place where space is a privilege and basic human dignity is often disregarded. Overcrowding is one of the most severe problems in the prison, turning an already harsh environment into a nightmare of suffocation, disease, and constant tension. Designed to hold far fewer inmates than it currently houses, Klong Prem is bursting at the seams, with thousands of prisoners crammed into cells that were never meant to accommodate so many. The overcrowding not only dehumanizes inmates, but also creates dangerous conditions that make survival a daily struggle. A typical cell in Klong Prem is a small, concrete space, originally built to house a handful of prisoners. However, due to the overwhelming number of incarcerations, many for minor drug offenses or petty crimes, cells that were meant for 6 to 10 people can now hold 30, 40, or even more. Prisoners are packed together with no personal space, forced to sleep in shifts or on top of one another. The lucky ones manage to claim a small section of the floor, while others are left sitting or standing all night, waiting for their turn to lie down. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the stench of open toilets that are often shared by dozens of inmates. With so many people crammed into such a small area, violence is inevitable. Tensions run high, and even the smallest disagreements can escalate into brutal fights. Inmates fight over space, food, and access to limited resources like clean water and toilets. The overcrowding means that there is no privacy. Prisoners must eat, sleep, and use the bathroom in front of one another, stripping away any sense of dignity or personal autonomy. The sanitation situation inside Klong Prem is horrifying. With so many inmates packed into one place, there simply aren't enough toilets or bathing facilities to accommodate everyone. Many cells have only a single squat toilet that quickly becomes clogged and overflows, spreading filth and disease. The lack of proper plumbing means that waste often sits stagnant for hours, attracting insects and creating unbearable odors. With limited access to running water, inmates struggle to wash themselves, their clothes, or their living spaces, leading to rampant skin infections, lice infestations, and other hygiene-related diseases. Water is a precious commodity inside Klong Prem, and getting enough to drink or clean oneself can be a daily battle. Prisoners must sometimes fight over access to the limited supply of clean water, while others resort to drinking from contaminated sources, risking illness. Showers are rare luxuries, and when they are available, they are often nothing more than a bucket of cold, dirty water. Inmates are sometimes forced to bathe in groups, packed together like animals, further stripping them of their dignity. The extreme overcrowding also worsens the spread of infectious diseases. In a prison where people are packed so closely together, illnesses spread rapidly, and with minimal medical care, even minor infections can become life-threatening. Tuberculosis, hepatitis, and skin diseases are rampant, with sick inmates often left untreated, infecting those around them. There is no quarantine for the ill. Prisoners with contagious diseases sleep right beside those who are still healthy, ensuring that sickness spreads unchecked. Aside from the physical suffering, the psychological effects of overcrowding are just as devastating. The constant noise, lack of personal space, and absence of any form of relief drive many inmates to the edge of sanity. There is nowhere to escape, nowhere to breathe freely, and no moment of solitude. The endless press of bodies, the deafening sounds of hundreds of voices echoing through concrete walls, and the relentless cycle of suffering create an atmosphere of hopelessness and despair. Prisoners become irritable, aggressive, or completely withdrawn, struggling to maintain their sanity in an environment that feels more like a cage for animals than a place for human beings. The prison authorities are well aware of the overcrowding crisis, yet little is done to address it. Instead of reducing the number of prisoners or improving facilities, the solution is often to cram more people into the same limited space, making an already dire situation even worse. The prison population continues to grow as Thailand's harsh drug laws and strict sentencing policies funnel more and more people into a system that cannot support them. For many inmates, the overcrowding is the most unbearable aspect of their imprisonment. They're not just serving a sentence. They're trapped in a living hell, where every moment is a fight for survival. Every breath is a struggle, and every day is spent in conditions unfit for human life. Lack of rehabilitation and hope for a future. Klong Prem Central Prison is not a place for rehabilitation. It is a place of punishment, despair, and lost futures. While prisons in many countries aim to reform inmates and prepare them for reintegration into society, Klong Prem offers no such opportunities. Once a person is locked inside, they are left to rot in a system that does nothing to improve them, educate them, or give them a second chance. Instead of guiding inmates toward a better path, the prison ensures that most leave more damaged, hardened, and hopeless than when they entered. Education and vocational training, which should be key components of any prison system aiming for rehabilitation, are almost non-existent inside Klong Prem. Inmates have no access to proper schooling, and even those who were once skilled professionals find themselves unable to practice or develop their knowledge. For the vast majority of prisoners, days are spent in mind-numbing monotony, with no structured activities, no books, and no chance to learn anything that could help them build a new life once released. Instead of offering inmates an opportunity to develop skills or improve themselves, Klong Prem leaves them idle, trapped in a cycle of boredom and survival. The lack of constructive activity often leads to further criminal behavior inside the prison. With no purpose or productive way to spend their time, many inmates become more deeply involved in the prison's violent gangs, illegal drug trade, and corrupt economy. Rather than reforming, they learn new criminal tactics and strengthen connections with organized crime, ensuring that even if they do leave prison, they are more likely to return. Mental health support and counseling, which could help prisoners deal with trauma and prepare for reintegration, are completely absent. Many inmates enter the prison already struggling with personal issues, whether it be drug addiction, emotional instability, or a history of abuse. However, there are no professionals to guide them, no therapy sessions to help them cope, and no programs designed to help them reflect on their actions and change their ways. Instead, they are left alone to suffer in silence, with their mental health deteriorating further under the weight of harsh conditions, brutal punishments, and daily violence. For those who do want change, there is little hope. Prisoners who show good behavior or express a desire to improve themselves often receive no recognition or reward. In many prison systems around the world, inmates can earn reduced sentences through rehabilitation programs, education, or demonstrating positive change. In Klong Prem, however, the only way to gain favor is through bribery and corruption. Sentence reductions are often given to those who can afford to pay off the right officials, while those without money remain stuck, no matter how much they try to improve. Religious or spiritual guidance, which could offer inmates a sense of peace or moral direction, is also severely limited. Some outside organizations may attempt to provide support, but their access is restricted and the number of prisoners they can reach is small. For most inmates, there is no moral or spiritual guidance to help them find meaning in their suffering or prepare for a better life after release. When inmates are finally released from Klong Prem, they face enormous challenges in re-entering society. With no skills, no support system, and often severe psychological trauma, many struggle to find work, reconnect with their families, or live a normal life. Society often rejects former prisoners, especially those with drug offenses, making it nearly impossible for them to build a new future. Many end up returning to crime, not because they want to, but because they see no other way to survive. Instead of being a place where people are given a chance to correct their mistakes and rebuild their lives, Klong Prem ensures that prisoners leave just as broken, if not more, than when they entered. Without education, mental health support, or vocational training, inmates are set up for failure, creating a revolving door where they are more likely to return to prison than to successfully reintegrate into society. Corruption and exploitation. Klong Prem Central Prison is not just a place of punishment. It is a business where corruption and exploitation determine the quality of life for inmates. The prison operates under a system where money and power dictate everything. Those who can pay are given privileges, while the poor are left to suffer. Corrupt guards, prison officials, and even other inmates take advantage of this broken system, turning incarceration into an opportunity for personal gain. The result is a deeply unjust environment where survival often depends on how much money an inmate can offer. Bribery is an essential part of life inside Klong Prem. Nearly every aspect of an inmate's existence, food, sleeping arrangements, protection, and even medical care, can be bought, but only for those who can afford it. Prisoners with money can pay guards to receive better living conditions, such as a space near a window or access to a mattress. In contrast, those without money are left crammed into the most overcrowded and unsanitary parts of the prison. Even a simple necessity like clean drinking water is often only available to those who can pay. Medical care, which should be a basic human right, is another area where corruption thrives. The prison's healthcare system is almost non-existent, but for the right price, inmates can receive medicine, doctor visits, or even transfers to a less crowded medical wing. Those who cannot pay are forced to suffer through illnesses without treatment, and in many cases, even minor conditions can become life-threatening due to neglect. Some prisoners have reported seeing fellow inmates die from treatable diseases simply because they lack the money to bribe a guard for medical attention. The corruption extends beyond basic needs and into the prison's black market economy. Guards and prison officials often collaborate with powerful inmates to smuggle in drugs, cell phones, and other contraband. These illegal goods are then sold at outrageous prices, with profits flowing into the pockets of corrupt officials. The prison's gangs are deeply involved in this trade, and prisoners who wish to participate must pay for the privilege. Those who refuse to engage in these dealings often become targets for violence or extortion. Extortion is another brutal reality of life inside Klong Prem. Powerful inmates, often referred to as bosses, control sections of the prison and demand payment from weaker prisoners in exchange for protection. Those who refuse to pay are beaten, deprived of food, or even killed. The guard are fully aware of these extortion schemes, but they rarely intervene, often because they, too, receive a share of the profits. Some inmates are forced to work in grueling, unpaid labor, with the money they generate going straight into the hands of corrupt officials. Even the legal system outside the prison is tainted by corruption, further trapping inmates in an endless cycle of exploitation. Some prisoners report that their families are pressured to pay bribes to secure early release, sentence reductions, or even basic legal representation. Those who cannot afford to pay remain stuck in the system, no matter how minor their crimes may have been. In some cases, inmates with long sentences have been able to buy their way into less severe punishment, while others with minor offenses languish behind bars simply because they lack the financial resources to secure better treatment. Prison guards, rather than serving as enforcers of order, often act as businessmen, profiting from the suffering of inmates. They manipulate the system to their advantage, ensuring that every aspect of prison life, whether it be food, safety, or medical care, can be monetized. Some guards have been known to deliberately withhold necessities, such as blankets during the cold months, unless prisoners pay for them. Others demand bribes simply to allow inmates to send letters or make phone calls to their families. For foreign prisoners, the situation can be even worse. Many foreign nationals imprisoned in Klong Prem find themselves at an even greater disadvantage, as they are unfamiliar with the corrupt system and often lack local connections to help them navigate it. Some are tricked into paying exorbitant sums for basic necessities, while others are abandoned entirely, unable to communicate with their families or receive outside support. The prison's authorities see them as easy targets, exploiting their desperation for profit. Justice is a meaningless concept within Klong Prem. The entire prison system operates on corruption, where money and power dictate who suffers and who thrives. Instead of offering rehabilitation, the prison is a marketplace of exploitation, where every aspect of survival has a price. Those who have money can buy their way into better conditions, while the poor are left defenseless, at the mercy of guards and gangs who see them as nothing more than a source of income. The psychological impact of long sentences and hopelessness. For many inmates inside Klong Prem Central Prison, the most devastating punishment is not just the physical suffering, but the psychological torment of long, seemingly endless sentences. The moment they are locked behind the towering walls of the prison, time becomes their greatest enemy. Days stretch into months, months into years, and for some, there is no end in sight. The overwhelming sense of hopelessness eats away at them, breaking their spirits long before their bodies give out. Long prison sentences, particularly for nonviolent crimes, are a harsh reality in Thailand. Many inmates serving time in Klong Prem are there because of strict drug laws that impose decades-long sentences for even minor offenses. Some prisoners are first-time offenders who made a single mistake, but are condemned to spend the majority of their lives behind bars. Others were given life sentences, or even death sentences for crimes that, in other countries, would have resulted in much shorter terms. The severity of these punishments leaves prisoners with little reason to hope, forcing them to confront the fact that their futures have been effectively erased. The sheer length of their sentences takes a severe psychological toll. When inmates first enter the prison, many hold on to the belief that they will somehow find a way to regain their freedom. But as the years pass, that hope begins to fade. Friends and family members on the outside move on with their lives. Letters and visits become less frequent, and eventually, many prisoners are forgotten entirely. This isolation compounds their despair, making them feel as though they no longer exist beyond the walls of the prison. Without a clear future, many prisoners lose their sense of identity. They become trapped in a monotonous, meaningless existence where each day is just a repetition of the last. There are no milestones to look forward to, no opportunities for personal growth, and no sense of progress. Instead, time becomes a heavy burden, a constant reminder of everything they have lost and will never regain. Some prisoners attempt to distract themselves with small routines, exercising in their tiny cells, talking to the few people they trust, or simply counting the days. But eventually, the weight of their sentences becomes too much to bear. Depression and anxiety are rampant among inmates serving long sentences. Many develop severe mental health issues, struggling with feelings of worthlessness, guilt, and overwhelming sadness. The uncertainty of their future only deepens their suffering. For those sentenced to life in prison, the knowledge that they will die within those walls creates a suffocating sense of doom. Others who have the possibility of release but face decades of incarceration grapple with a different kind of despair. The realization that by the time they are free, they will have lost their youth, their families, and any chance of a normal life. Suicidal thoughts are common among those who see no way out of their suffering. Some prisoners, after years of struggling to cope with the endless monotony and emotional isolation, decide to take their own lives rather than endure another decade of imprisonment. Others slowly give up in different ways, refusing to eat, withdrawing from social interaction, or engaging in self-destructive behaviors. The prison system, rather than intervening to provide mental health support, largely ignores these individuals, allowing their suffering to continue unchecked. For those who do eventually get released after serving long sentences, reintegration into society is an enormous challenge. Many have been incarcerated for so long that the outside world feels foreign and unfamiliar. They have missed out on decades of technological advancements, social changes, and personal milestones. Some are unable to reconnect with their families, who have moved on or even disowned them. Others find it nearly impossible to find work, as their criminal records and lack of experience make employment opportunities scarce. The psychological damage inflicted by their time in Klong Prem follows them long after they have walked out of its gates, ensuring that, even in freedom, they remain imprisoned in their own minds. For those still inside, the endless passage of time continues to wear them down. They watch as fellow inmates come and go, as new prisoners arrive with the same fear and desperation they once felt, and as others lose their battles against hopelessness. The long sentences imposed by the Thai justice system do not just keep criminals off the streets. They break human beings, turning them into shadows of who they once were. ChatGPT said, "The emotional toll on families and loved ones. The emotional toll on families and loved ones. The The suffering of an inmate inside Klong Prem Central Prison does not end at the prison walls. It extends far beyond, reaching their families and loved ones who are left to endure a different kind of torment. The moment a person is sentenced to years, decades, or even life behind bars, their family is sentenced as well. The emotional, financial, and social burden placed on the inmates' loved ones is immense, and in many cases, just as devastating as the conditions the prisoner faces inside. For many families, the initial shock of the arrest and sentencing is only the beginning of a long and painful journey. In Thailand, where harsh penalties are often handed down even for minor offenses, relatives are forced to watch helplessly as their loved one is taken away, knowing that they may never return. The legal process can be confusing and overwhelming, especially for families who are unfamiliar with the system or lack the financial resources to hire competent legal representation. Many are left feeling powerless, unable to do anything to help their loved one avoid the nightmare that awaits them in Klong Prem. Once the sentence is handed down, families must come to terms with the harsh reality of prison life. They hear stories of overcrowding, violence, corruption, and disease, knowing that their loved one is suffering through it all with no way to escape. The thought of their son, daughter, father, mother, or sibling enduring such horrific conditions fills them with constant anxiety and grief. Parents lose sleep wondering if their child is safe, while children grow up missing a parent who should have been there to guide them. The emotional weight is unbearable, yet there is little they can do to change the situation. Visitation becomes one of the only ways families can maintain a connection with their incarcerated loved one, but even that is filled with challenges. Klong Prem imposes strict visitation rules, limiting the number of visits, the length of time families can spend together, and even the physical contact allowed. For many, traveling to the prison is an expensive and exhausting ordeal, requiring long journeys, waiting in endless lines, and dealing with bureaucratic hurdles. Some families, especially those living in rural areas or overseas, simply cannot afford the cost of travel, meaning they go years without seeing their loved one, if they ever see them again at all. Even when visits are possible, they are often heartbreaking. Seeing a loved one behind bars, weak from malnutrition, scarred for violence, and stripped of their dignity, is a painful experience. Conversations are brief and monitored, leaving little room for true connection. Families must pretend to be strong, offering words of encouragement even when their own hearts are breaking. Many leave the prison in tears, haunted by the image of their loved one in such a desperate state. The financial strain on families is another major burden. The reality of life in Klong Prem is that survival often depends on money. Inmates who have financial support from their families can buy better food, cleaner water, medical care, and even protection from violence. But for many families, this means making enormous sacrifices. Parents, spouses, and siblings may go into debt, take on extra jobs, or sell their belongings just to send money to their loved one in prison. Some are forced to choose between providing for the rest of the family and ensuring that the imprisoned relative has enough to survive. It is an impossible choice, one that causes further stress and guilt. Beyond the emotional and financial toll, there's also the stigma that comes with having a family member in prison. In Thai society, and in many cultures around the world, having a relative behind bars carries a heavy social burden. Friends and neighbors may distance themselves, treating the family as if they, too, are criminals. Employers may hesitate to hire someone associated with an inmate, and even extended family members may turn their backs out of shame or fear of judgment. This isolation only deepens the suffering, making the family feel as though they, too, are imprisoned by society's perception of them. For children of incarcerated parents, the impact can be especially devastating. Growing up without a mother or father leaves deep emotional scars. They may struggle in school, face bullying from peers, or develop behavioral and emotional problems due to the absence of a parental figure. Some children are too young to understand why their parent is gone, while others grow up resenting the justice system that took them away. The damage is lasting, affecting their self-esteem, relationships, and future opportunities. As the years go by, families continue to carry the weight of their loved ones' incarceration. Some hold on to hope, counting down the days until their release. Others begin to lose faith, unable to see a future where their family will be whole again. The uncertainty of parole, the fear of worsening prison conditions, and the knowledge that their loved one may never come home take an unimaginable toll. For those whose relatives do eventually regain their freedom, the challenges do not end. The former inmate often returns home as a changed person, carrying the trauma of prison life with them. Rebuilding relationships is difficult, and reintegration into society is often met with obstacles. Many former inmates struggle to find work, reconnect with their children, or even adjust to the simple realities of daily life outside prison. Families, after years of suffering, must now navigate the complexities of healing and starting over. But for those whose loved ones do not make it out, whether due to a long sentence, a life term, or death inside the prison, the pain never truly fades. The knowledge that their relatives spent their final days in suffering, without freedom, without dignity, haunts them forever. The emotional toll of Klong Prem extends far beyond the inmates themselves. It breaks families, shatters lives, and leaves wounds that never fully heal. A system of endless suffering. Klong Prem Central Prison is more than just a place of confinement. It is a symbol of a deeply flawed justice system that prioritizes punishment over rehabilitation, suffering over reform, and corruption over fairness. Inside its overcrowded cells, thousands of inmates endure a daily existence defined by violence, despair, and hopelessness. The lack of basic human rights, coupled with the psychological torment of long sentences, ensures that most prisoners leave more broken than they entered, if they leave at all. For many, the walls of Klong Prem represent a life of no return. The absence of rehabilitation programs means inmates have little to no chance of reintegrating into society, forcing them into a cycle of crime and incarceration. Families suffer alongside them, burdened with financial struggles, emotional devastation, and the social stigma of having a loved one behind bars. The corruption that runs through the system ensures that justice is not given to those who deserve it, but to those who can afford it. A prison should not be a place where human dignity is stripped away, where suffering is accepted as normal, or where the system itself creates more criminals than it reforms. Yet, Klong Prem continues to function as a machine of despair, feeding on the lives of those trapped within it. Until real change is made, through prison reform, fair sentencing laws, and an end to corruption, this cycle of misery will persist, ensuring that Klong Prem remains not just a place of punishment, but a place of no return.